Hi everyone, I'm here with Dr. Emily Helder and fellow research assistant Francie, and we are just talking a little bit about the Stauffer adoption case. And in our last video, we talked about the importance of adoption competency for clinicians. And now we're going to kind of move into the role of the parent versus the adoptee in adoptions. And in situations such as the Stauffers, the reason for dissolution appears to have a little more to do with the incompetence of the parents rather than the well-being of the child. And it seems like a lot of the research and media surrounding adoption usually focuses on the parents. And what do you think this is kind of attributed to? Because it seems to be a pretty common theme.
Yeah, there's been a lot of, I think, critique of the adoption field and research and, even like books for lay audiences, that a lot of it's centered on the adoptive parent perspective. And I think especially more recently, there's the acknowledgement that there's been an ignoring or less of a focus on the adoptee experience and perspective and how valuable that is, how important that is, how it needs to be centered. Because sometimes I think there's been a missing of important issues, important framing, or a misunderstanding sometimes when the adoptee perspective kind of isn't centered. So I would say that's a fair critique of the adoption literature and adoption writing and blogging and that kind of thing. Yeah, too often I think it focuses on centering the adoptive parent perspective.
I know we kind of talked about this a little bit before, but Micah kind of explained that her main reason for her adoption dissolution was because she thought this was the best for Huxley and that he wants this 100%. There's a lot of skepticism regarding this statement, and I think we touched on this before, just due to age even. Do you think adoption dissolution is more for the parent or for the adoptee?
Yeah, so every situation, like we've been saying, every situation is unique and so different, and so it's hard to make these generalizations. But what the research does show is that the majority of time that an adoption dissolves, that child is adopted again, and that second adoption is stable and permanent. So that suggests that it has more to do with like the fit and the preparation and the support with that first placement, and that if we did a better job with fit and placement and support and those kinds of factors, that we could probably reduce adoption dissolution.
Okay. I think one of the really harder questions for me as an adoptee to look at is whether adoption is harder for the parent or the adoptee. I have gotten the opportunity to be adopted into a home where I have two other adopted siblings and a biological sibling. And so it's been really interesting to look at all of the differences and how we've kind of handled each of our adoption, because we were all relatively young when we were adopted. My little brother was the oldest and he was 2.5. But I was adopted at 9 months. My sister was adopted at 6 months. But kind of growing up, we each handled the situation and the aftermath super differently, I think. And so for me, this question is kind of impossible because nobody really has, I guess an adoptee that becomes a parent of an adoptee has kind of best of both worlds. But as an adoptee, I think we face, especially international adoptees, kind of the transracial barrier, and then also this feeling of shame and this feeling of guilt is very present, and this feeling of just kind of like overall unwantedness. And then for the parents, I know this is hard because adoptees express this all in very different ways. I saw this throughout all of my siblings. Like there's the rebellious side, and then there's also the perfectionist side and just like the high anxiety side and stuff. And so I think parents have to learn how to deal with some of these really hard issues, and also just watching someone that they love so much just kind of go through such hardship and not being able to understand that and not being able to take that away from them. So I don't know. What is your opinion as a parent?
Yeah. I mean, I think that like every situation is unique, and people go through different things at different times. I mean, for adoptees, it seems to vary across the lifespan, right? So like, and I wouldn't necessarily call all these things struggles, just maybe things that they encounter or are curious about, right? So like, it's normal for adoptees to be curious about different aspects of their adoption and identity. They tend to wonder about different things at different stages, right? So early on, they might wonder more about the circumstances of their removal or separation. When they get older, maybe they have more questions about their family medical history, like that kind of thing. But identity development, coping with the aftermath of abuse and neglect, if that was a part of their story. Another thing we haven't talked about yet is this idea of adoption microaggressions, where people, we have sort of a bionormative society. And so people make comments about adoption, and for transracial adoptees, sometimes they can be sort of a mix of adoption and race microaggressions. So those are things that adoptees, I think, have to encounter and figure out how they want to approach and deal with. From the adoptive family side, I think the first task is really that developing of the attachment and, figuring out the bumps in that. Parenting stress, right? If kids are experiencing difficulties, and then being able to become an advocate to really access the services or supports, that they might need. So it's really complicated.
Yeah. The whole microaggression thing is like, I noticed that so much in my life. Like I get told that I look like my siblings a lot, but we're all from different cities in China. So I think that's really interesting, because that just kind of reiterates the whole like racial thing of all Asians look alike, and also just like, I don't know, it's just kind of funny. And then I've also it's kind of crazy, because a lot of times people don't even realize that they do it. But I've had like teachers even talk to me about like my adoption, and I had one teacher tell me that they think that I've integrated myself very well into society. And it's just kind of like, these comments are so, I don't know.
Yeah, people say a lot of really, I mean, the intent is not always bad, but the harm, the impact is there. Yeah. I know. It's very pervasive.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess just going back to the topic of like adoptees and parents, what are the different struggles? I think we kind of touched on it a little bit, but as a adoption researcher, what are the different struggles that you see adoptees and parents and adoptive families like even go through?
Yeah, I think it varies so much from family to family, but I think the big things for adoptees are the identity piece, coping with the themes that you discussed about loss and guilt and shame, those kind of things. For parents, it's really being able to turn themselves into the kind of parent that child needs, accessing services, those kind of things. So yeah, it varies a lot based on role.
Kind of going off of that and sort of keeping in theme with like the parent experience, is there a difference between how parents react, or like just what their experiences are based on their gender or even like the family structure? Because I know currently there's significantly more controversy concerning the mother of Huxley, and there's not very much about the father. And like, granted, she did have a YouTube channel where she featured him a lot, but the two of them also shared a family YouTube channel, and her husband Jimmy has his own channel that's pretty successful. It's getting close to 1 million followers or subscribers, I think, on YouTube. And I'm just curious as to if there's sort of a gender difference. And also, she mentioned in a few videos that Huxley seemed to connect more with the father initially. And she even said that Huxley completely rejected me. And is there kind of a reason for this? Does gender play a role?
Yeah. I mean, I think it maybe. I wouldn't say it's like a pattern where it's always the mother, has more difficulty attaching necessarily, but I have seen this in other families where one parent has a more difficult road in developing that attachment. Some of that's due to the fit between, that parent and the child. Some of it's due to the adoptive parent's own attachment internal working models, and how they think about relationships. Some of it's personality, right? So I don't think that's uncommon. Some of it too can be due to the early experiences of the child, right? So if a kid has experienced abuse and neglect, for example, at the hands of a particular parent prior to adoption, then maybe they have more difficulty with developing trusting relationships with that same gender parent. So there can be a variety of different things. Yeah. But I mean, it seems as though, the parents need to be patient in that process, that's really key. It's not, attachment unfolds over time. Parents shouldn't expect to have an attachment happen right away.
For this next question, I don't want to at all discount the importance of a parent in the adoption discussion, because I think that their voice is obviously so important. They're the one raising the child. But do you think that centering the adoption discussion on parents kind of promotes this idea of the savior complex in a way where we give more attention to the parents? So that kind of makes it seem like they're more important. And I don't know, I think adoptees already kind of deal with that feeling of having a debt that they can never repay. So
Yeah. And I think that's something too that maybe people not involved in adoption might misunderstand, or at least I hear this from adoptees, that people expect them to be grateful for their adoption, and that centering of the adoptive parent maybe perpetuates that narrative of expected gratitude. And, to me, you really have to think about holding several things in tension. Yes, I mean, you can speak to this too, Francie, that adoptees can be thankful for their family and really love and care for their family, and at the same time experience, loss or grief related to, aspects of the separation. And so I have problems when we center the adoptive parent perspective too much and create this narrative of expected gratitude, because that doesn't really acknowledge some of the harder parts, especially from the adoptee perspective. So yeah, I think there's been a lot of recognition of that in the adoption research community and adoption clinical community. And I'm so thankful. A lot of that has come from adoptees themselves who have really aged into, the part where they're going to graduate school and they're, becoming researchers and clinicians, and are really leading the field in doing a better job in centering that perspective and recognizing that. Yeah. So hopefully this was helpful in thinking about the different roles of the parent and the adoptive child. We'll talk a little bit about, broaden our perspective a bit, and talk about the ethics of sharing about your kids on social media in our next episode.